Hello, and happy Christmas week. It's Monday, December the 18th, so next week this time we will have survived Christmas Eve and we'll be celebrating with family and friends. I typically film on Mondays, so I haven't decided what I'm going to do next week. Maybe I'll do something on location in front of the Christmas tree. But the thoughts of the holidays always make me think a little bit about family, and often think about family who are not with us anymore. And it also makes me think a lot when I'm in the shop and I'm looking at the handcrafts that surround me of those folks who have been my mentors and the ones who have helped teach me some of the things that I know about how to do the various stitching techniques that we enjoy. I think of mentors who've helped me learn how to run a business. My friend Sally, whose shop I interned in and learned how to do framing. So I think it's just a nice time to reflect on those people who've been those kind of influences over us in our lives. And I certainly want to end with an exhortation that those of us who have skills and opportunities to share what we know should continue to be doing that and create legacies for the future. I'm sure you've read, as I have, that it only takes one adult in the life of a child to make a difference in that child's life and to turn them around and have them go in a direction that nobody would have ever guessed at the time. So certainly that's the way I want to end today, with that hopefulness and that thought of the holidays. But I'd like to today, and you saw the pictures that I began the video with today, I'd like to pay special attention to my grandmother. If you've watched my TED Talk, you will have seen me talk some about my father's mother, Maisie Sly, and at the very end of that TED Talk, I mentioned my other grandmother, Mabel Montgomery Moses. She was born in Princeton, West Virginia, named after Montgomery County, and that's where most of her family moved to during the wars. There was an armament factory in Radford, Virginia, and many of the family members moved down from West Virginia into southwestern Virginia, and that's where my grandmother Mabel grew up. She married my grandfather, Luther Cawley, in 1930. Right in the midst of that terrible Great Depression. And I was lucky that I got to grow up with my grandparents. I knew all four of my grandparents, lived within pretty good visiting distance, if you will, of them. But particularly for me, my mother's mother, my grandmother Cawley, or as I called her, Mamas, was just a very important influence over me. I would encourage you, as you hear my stories, to think about the stories that you would tell your family and your friends about somebody who influenced you in that way. But Mamas, for me, was a soulmate. I really don't know any other way to describe it. As an older adult myself now, I can think of very few people in the whole history of my life that I've had that kind of connection with. I was rarely very far from Mama's. I went off to college and was in graduate school when she passed away. But for most of my life, I saw her probably once a week, maybe 2 or 3 times a month, something like that. So we were never very far away, but we always had a connection. I loved watching her do the things that she enjoyed. I've mentioned in earlier videos how important learning to cook with her was for me. My mother didn't like to cook, didn't take much interest in it, but Mama's was always doing something in the kitchen, and you could just about always find me there. She was also a bit of an inspiration for me in terms of stitching. Unfortunately, I don't have any of the objects that she stitched. I don't know of anything that I own right now that shows her seamstress skills, but I do remember her teaching me how to sew a hem. And for her, it was important that all the stitches be perfectly even, and it was important that you angle your needle in as you went so that the stitch itself would show as little as possible. You'd get as much ground as you could out of that thread, but you wouldn't see the stitches very well. My grandfather was a night watchman at an upholstery factory near the end of his working life before he retired. And she would take old scraps of upholstery fabric and turn them into pillows. Those are the main things that I remember her creating when I was a child. She didn't have many resources, so I don't think she would ever have really had the opportunity to do crafts where you had to go out and buy supplies. But for her, it had always been a matter of kind of making do and doing what she could with what she had. And her hand sewing was really her triumph. But far and above all that was going in the kitchen with Mama's. Even until probably 6 months before she died, every time that I came home from college, I always got a meal prepared especially for me. And she knew exactly what I wanted. And even if my grandfather would grumble because he'd had too much fried chicken and he didn't want any more, I got fried chicken. And the chicken livers were always especially prepared, and they were always on the edge. And it was made plain that the only person that got those chicken livers was Gary. So every time I came home, and as many times as it could be squeezed in when I was growing up as a child, I'd have fried chicken, and then I'd always have cherry cobbler for dessert. And I shared that cherry cobbler recipe with you a while back. The first fiber art that I ever did was a scarf that I knitted for Mama's. You can see here that it's not terribly fancy. There's no fringe. I was just doing a basic knitting stitch. Didn't know how to do any more than that. Really, as far as knitting's concerned, still don't know how to do much more than that. And I probably did this about the age of 12, about the time that I first learned how to do netting. And so these are colors that a 12-year-old would choose. I still like bright colors. I still like red the most. And I made this scarf because there was nobody else who would appreciate it more than Mama's. So I made it for her, and I gave it to her. Now, if you've ever seen my TED Talk, you know I mentioned in there that she loved soft pastels and pinks, and she didn't wear bright colors at all. But when the beloved grandson gave her this vivid green and white scarf, she wrapped it around herself, and she wore it as if it were made of spun gold. And I have pictures of her at Christmas time with the scarf. I wasn't able to find one in order to post it, but that kind of connection with her comes to mind every time I see this scarf. And I hope that I'll have this scarf forever. And when I'm done, the story that is associated with it will be passed down along with photos and things like that as part of our shared legacy. I, like many of us, remember spending the night at my grandparents' and thinking about what a wonderful treat that was. When I was a small child, they didn't have central heating. They didn't have a furnace. They had coal stoves in a couple places in the house. And I can remember my grandfather having to get up very early before anybody else did and stoke the fire and put fresh coal on the fire so that by the time we grandchildren were ready to get up, the house was nice and toasty warm. And the next memory I always had whenever I was staying at my grandparents' house was hearing my grandmother in the kitchen. She'd start banging around with the cast iron frying pan and plates and dishes and all that sort of stuff long before I emerged from the covers and found my way into the kitchen to see what was going on. Now, breakfast at their house, especially when we kids were there, was always country ham. My grandfather would go out in the country and buy them, probably illegally, but buy them off folks who salted and cured them themselves. and he'd bring them home, and he'd hang one out in the not the outhouse, but one of their outbuildings that kept it cool during the winter. And of course, it was salty. It had been salt cured, and he'd go out and cut a few slabs of country ham off for us, and he'd bring it back in. My grandmother would have the cast iron frying pan on the stove. She would have biscuits in the oven. She would fry up the ham, and then that wonderful ham grease is what we would use to have eggs and all the other kind of things. And a special treat when I was at my grandparents' house was to have coffee. Now, I don't know about you, but the adults always told me I couldn't drink coffee because it would stunt my growth. You know, I'm sure at some point my grandmother told her children that, but the grandchildren could have whatever they wanted. And I always felt like I was the king of the world when I was at my grandmother's house. So she would make me a cup of coffee, and she would fill it up with sugar so that it was just as sweet as it can be. And that's still how I like my coffee. She cooked it on a little percolator on the stove, and it would cool enough, and I would have a big boy cup of coffee. And I thought, I really did think I was king of the world then, with country ham and fresh biscuits and eggs and all the things that went along with that. And, you know, I guess one of the reasons I was thinking about Mama so much this time of year is the preparations for Christmas. Everybody knew that you needed to be at Mama's and Granddad's house sometime after probably 10 or 11 o'clock on Christmas Day. Our family would have, you know, a Christmas the night before. Sometimes my grandparents would come over. We would also visit my other set of grandparents most Christmas, but Christmas Day noon meal was Mama's. And she'd start preparing for it. She'd start buying things. She'd make fresh homemade light rolls. She'd bake a turkey and a ham, all the desserts, all the veggies. Now, in our tradition, we always had things like potato salad and deviled eggs for Christmas Day. Not quite sure where that comes from. I've often kind of thought about our heritage. A lot of our heritage is from the United Kingdom, Ireland, Scotch-Irish kind of traditions. And I guess potatoes were really big. So I haven't run into too many families here in the South who had something other than mashed potatoes for Christmas Day, but ours was pretty much always potato salad, and deviled eggs were an important part of that as well. And, you know, everybody would then gather at their house, and there'd be little card tables and benches and stuff set up all over the house because there wasn't going to be enough room for everybody to sit around the table. They had a tiny little kitchen and a small house for that matter. And we would have opened whatever gifts that Santa had brought us before we got there, and we would be allowed to bring some special something that we had gotten that we could carry with us to show off to everybody. And again, you know, just the spirit of the family gathering together and all the kind of holiday joy that brought really does make me think especially fondly of my family and that legacy as we come to this holiday season. So what I said at the beginning is I'd really like to use this as a chance to encourage you to tell these stories as part of your legacy. Think about who it was that inspired you to do some of the things that you love to do today. If you're a stitcher, if you're a knitter, if you're a crocheter, if you do woodwork, if you cook, who was it that was part of your life? Now, for me, my grandmother was a big influence when it came to cooking. There were other folks, mostly women, along the way who taught me various aspects of needlework. My 6th grade teacher, Louise Chittum, was the one that taught me how to knit. I think I've told the story a lot. When I was in the 6th grade, she could knit and talk at the same time, and that just enthralled me. And she eventually got me a set of knitting needles after I figured out how to knit with pencils, and got me started. And I'm sure those knitting needles were what I used to make this scarf for my grandmother. Who is it who was it, maybe they continue to be a part of your tradition, who inspired you and got you started. And the concern I hear all the time from people is that all cross stitch and knitting and needlepoint and all those things, they're dying out. That happens only if we let that happen. I have young people from early ages, 10, 11, all the way up to their 30s and 40s, who once they see what's available to them and what kind of crafts are around, are quite excited to learn how to do it. There was a little boy here in the shop last week. His mother stopped by. They kept riding by here every day, and the little boy kept saying, I want to go there, I want to go there. Finally, she brought him in. He's not quite 12, so he's just a little bit younger than I was when I started. And when he walked in the door, I could tell he loved this place. He would go and he'd look at the yarns and he'd look at the loom, and just everything about it enthralled him. Now, the problem with today and the problem with young people learning how to do these things that we love is that they often don't see anybody doing it. That's why Embroidery Guild of America and other groups have programs where you stitch in public, or where you go to fairs if you're part of a weaver's guild and show people the act of weaving. If you are a typical kid growing up today, you probably don't have somebody in your family who does this stuff, and so you don't see it. Maybe you live far away from relatives, or maybe your relatives don't have the time and the energy to do these kind of crafts anymore. I have no way of knowing, but I would guess at least 1 in 10 children would, if they had the opportunity, pick this stuff up and learn how to do it. Not all kids love to do this. It just doesn't match everybody's skills. I have 3 children, and my youngest son is an avid crocheter. The other 2 have tried various aspects of it, and it's just not their passion, and that's fine. But what we need to do is we need to be doing this, and we need to be talking about it, and we need to be sharing it, because we can't necessarily assume that younger people are not interested. I worked for 4 years part-time at Universal Studios, and there I was surrounded by millennials all day, every day, and I've got to tell you, I loved it. Millennials are a wonderful generation, no matter what you may have heard or no matter what you may have experienced. And they look for us for information. They don't want to be talked down to. They don't want us speaking to them in a condescending way as if we know everything and they know nothing, because they've got a good bit of knowledge in their heads. But they're eager to learn. And while I was there, I would make little cross-stitch kits. I'd put a needle and some fabric and a thread and a basic pattern, and I gave away about 20 of those. And I would guess again, probably only 2 or 3 of those 20 really got excited about it and started doing something. But even today, I can see posts from a couple of the folks who I introduced cross-stitch to who are still doing it. So I just want to drive home that whole idea of the legacy of handmade objects. The things that are passed down to us, those treasures that were made by somebody else, the things that we made ourselves as a tribute to somebody in our family that have a history that we don't want to be lost. And finally, this idea that we should be telling those stories and teaching these skills to the generations that come after us. I can't think of anything better to celebrate family and holidays and the coming new year than to think about ways that we can share the crafts that we love so much. I think I'm going to wish you a happy holiday today. Hanukkah just ended, and we're heading into Christmas season. Some will be celebrating Kwanzaa. Diwali, the Hindu tradition, was passed a few weeks back. There's all kinds of wonderful celebrations going on around us, and I hope yours is blessed and safe and comfortable. And I'll talk to you next week. This is Gary Sly with the Legacy of Handmade Objects.